Welcome to the 2022 Guest Faculty Lecture Series for Humanities 196, the Symposium. Today we are honored to have Dr. Steve Horn with us as our guest faculty speaker. Dr. Horn has a BA from California State University, an MA from San Diego State University, and a PhD from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. Dr. Horn's primary areas of academic interest include the political economy, race and gender, democratic theory and practice, and American foreign policy. Today, the title of Dr. Horn's talk is Everything Must Change. In the next 10 minutes, or we're doomed. What political science can tell us about where we are, where we need to go, and how to get there. Will you please give a warm welcome for Dr. Steve Horn.
Thank you, Charles. So when I was first told about the Honors Symposium theme, falling in love all over again, and it was meant to kind of attach to our disciplines. My discipline is political science. My reaction was, I hate my discipline. I can't do this. And it isn't that I don't like teaching, right? I consider myself to have one of the best jobs in the world. I get to come and talk to students who are hopefully also interested about subjects that I care deeply about. But the concern is that, especially over the last few years, I've sort of felt a sense of hopelessness, and the sense that we're facing as a country and as a society problems that are hopelessly intractable. So my email back to Charles was, I don't know if I can do this, probably has something to do with it. As a society, we're going over multiple cliffs with not a lot of time to stop the process. And this was sort of combined with my idea of progressive change. My theory of progressive change that I think maps onto this country's history in a very compelling way. That is to say, the way I think change happens takes a long time. And we'll talk about that as we get going here. And as my sort of tongue-in-cheek title suggests, we don't have a lot of time. For some of the problems that I thought about, we have maybe a little bit more, who knows how much, but for the main problem that we face, and I'll focus on that a bit more than the other problems, climate change, we really don't have much time at all. In fact, you could just change that 10 minutes to 10 years, and that's approximately what we have to make significant changes to the way we do things in order to preserve civilization as we know it. So that was my reaction, and I decided to use that reaction to structure what I want to talk about today, obviously. But here were some of the things I had in mind when I reacted to the humanities theme, right? So these are all cliffs, meaning we're about to go over them in one way or another. And at the top of the list, as I mentioned, is climate change. Right, so I'll focus on that especially. But also, obviously, we're going through a continued pandemic with really no end in sight in terms of when or if we'll actually, it will be over. I would also suggest that we are continuing over a militarism cliff, criminal justice cliff. You can go down the line, a media cliff, racism, sexism, free speech, democracy. It's enough to cause a political scientist to just sort of curl up in bed and not get out of it, right? But we can't do that, we can't afford that. So I think what I can do is try to present a vision of why This is happening. Help us understand why are we in such dire straits? And I think I've done that today. We'll see what you think. And it is complementary to the article I had you read, written by David Sirota, who has just helped produce a new movie that I recommend that you watch called Don't Look Up. And the movie is about a comet approaching Earth, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but the basic is, the teaser is, it's about a comet approaching Earth, so extinction level event, and then the reaction of the political class and society is basically, they don't react to the challenge, right? So I'll leave it at that. So how would I frame all of this? What's going on? I would suggest to you that the best way to understand the path we're traveling and the reason why we can't react, and even the reason why a lot of these disasters in the making have arisen, I would frame this under a discussion of neoliberalism. And I'm not using the term liberal in this sense, in the way that you might normally hear it used. So I'm not talking about sort of progressives on the Democratic Party side, right? So not like the way Nancy Pelosi thinks, although I think she's part of this too. But instead, it's a much more classical hearkening to the idea of liberalism focused on individual rights and liberties, and focused on the idea of markets, right? Economic markets. So Adam Smith and the invisible hand and all of that stuff is part of the mythology that goes into what I would describe as the logic of our times. Now, neoliberalism suggests something different than the classical variant, right? So I have no bones to pick with the idea of individual liberty and freedom and all of that. But neoliberalism is a particular way of organizing that set of ideals. I think the political scientist Adolph Reed Jr. summed up neoliberalism best in this short, simple sentence. It is corporate capitalism operating without any serious democratic challenge. So the magic of the marketplace, or the force of the marketplace, in quotation marks, as I've got here, and I'll explain that in a moment, sort of running roughshod over any idea of the common good, right? It involves a scenario context where power is concentrated in the hands of the few for the few. For example, right now, 0.1% of the American public, so the very top, owns approximately 20% of the household wealth, right? So a tremendous concentration of power at the top that is able to be leveraged against the political system and drive the logic of society. Likewise, at the corporate level, if you used taxes collected by governments and revenue collected by corporations, you'd have roughly half, if not more than half, corporations as the biggest economic entities in the world rather than governments. So really, this is a privatization of society with a logic that government can't do anything right. Right? Now that has to be put in quotation marks, and I want to explain that in a moment in the same way that I suggested I would, market-driven, which is right here. But if you want some more ways to think about this, I think an acronym and a phrase that Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of England, is remembered for, among other things, is useful here. So she once said, and she was a committed neoliberal of the extreme type, market, tearing down government, reliance on the market, corporate capitalism. She said, there is no such thing as society, right? There are only individuals, there are only families, there are only business firms. But no conception, right? We shouldn't think of society as something to concern ourselves with or that might have a viewpoint, let's say, like the common good. Also, the acronym that she's famous for, TINA, stands for There Is No Alternative. Socialism or some other ism is not a viable alternative. Neoliberal capitalism is the end game, right? This sort of thinking was reproduced in scholarship over the years. There's a famous book called The End of History, which essentially argued that we've come to the end of our ideological struggles. Capitalism in its present form is essentially the end of the story, right? What are some of the more specific features of neoliberalism? Privatization. So think in terms of the trend towards marginalizing the post office and a trend towards private businesses taking over those sorts of operations. Deregulation, allowing corporations to basically do whatever the market allows them to do. If the market punishes them, then fine. But governments shouldn't try to take the rough edges off of capitalism by structuring it with regulations. Low taxes. One of Bernie Sanders' critiques of the economy is that there were giant corporations that didn't pay any taxes, right? And then market-driven. The idea is the market is the arbiter of value. If you make a certain amount of money, that's because the market valued you, and that's the true nature of value. If you made a certain profit, it's because the society valued what your company did, and that's the nature of value. And implicit in all of this is if you don't produce value or if you go bankrupt, then that's the way it should be. But I've got market-driven in here partly because that's not the way it works for the powerful, right? In fact, all we need to think about is the way the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 played out. Here were Wall Street banks that had preached the gospel of Ayn Rand, preached the gospel of individual responsibility and the capitalist marketplace with all of those implications. And then as soon as they went bankrupt for their own, as a matter of their own actions, guess who came calling to the government for help? And they got it, right? So neoliberalism involves more or less market enforced outcomes for the average person, right? But not so much for the powerful who still believe in government.
There's kind of a meme that describes this pattern. It would be, market, a free market for thee, socialism for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, that's that.
Chomsky. Yeah,
Chomsky.
yeah. There's another aspect of this as well. We're encouraged to believe that all of the technologies and all of the wealth that has been produced because we turned towards allowing the market to drive everything. That's not the way it works. Right? That's what we're encouraged to believe. But, and I would challenge you to go and research this, right? But every technology, cutting edge technology, so I'm not talking about umbrellas that are stuck in adult beverage, right? That kind of product. I'm talking about cutting edge technology, like computers, like pharmaceuticals. If you look at where that technology came from, it came from significant investment from the public sphere, often just sort of turned over to the corporate sphere. If we think about the story of computers, how did those arise? Often we're encouraged to think about, well, that technology started in the 1970s with eventual billionaires and geniuses like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs tinkering in their garages. But the story of computers begins decades before with public investment and the production of computers that would take a room bigger than this to fill them. Now, obviously, this technology was not marketable, right? It wasn't commercial. You couldn't make a profit off of it. And that's usually the way it works, is the government or government funding will encourage or sponsor or undertake the investment that it takes to produce technology. And then when it becomes profitable, that's when it's turned over for private actors to benefit from and develop into a consumer good. Sort of the catch there, though, is they don't give back to the same government that helped, or the same society, the same average person taxpayer that helped produce that technology in the first place. So it's sort of like a repeated kind of way that meme you mentioned, markets for thee, socialism for me, right? So this is profit-driven logic. Whatever is profitable is good. Radical inequality is an offshoot of this, right? And the rise of a gig economy. And I would use Everett Community College as an example of this, right? So gig economy means that under this logic, neoliberal logic, people just don't have jobs like they used to. They don't have careers like they used to. At Everett Community College, what does this mean? A few things. In the 1970s and prior, over 2/3 of your instructors would have been tenured. They would have had jobs that were guaranteed from year to year, at salaries that were paying a living wage as a matter of course. They would have benefits. Fast forward, the impact of neoliberalism and, again, the so-called market efficiency, and most of your instructors are associate faculty or part-time, meaning they have to scrounge for classes in order to pay the bills, right? This is, again, done in the auspices of economic efficiency. But what it does is it undervalues the work of your instructors who've taken decades to earn the degrees that they have. And I should acknowledge that I'm one of the few that snuck in under the wire and I have a tenured job, right? So I have that sort of job where I can be confident that I have stability in my career and employment, unlike most of my colleagues at this point. And the trend is further and further and further. I would also extend this to the student experience as well. The neoliberal logic is that you should pay for that seat you're sitting in, right? So whereas the country supported higher education through taxes and subsidies so that you could get a college degree from Berkeley or many of the other high-powered universities in the past, at this point, most of the money has to come from the student themselves, making it much more difficult to actually get the degree you're after, right? I would say the logic of neoliberalism actually has played itself out in several ways during the pandemic as well. So this emphasis on the individual, emphasis on freedom in a very constrained way, has led many during the pandemic to adopt a position that it should be left up to them to take the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And it's a matter of their freedom and their individual liberty to resist taking a free, safe, effective vaccine that has been produced in much the way that I think in prior to neoliberalism, these things tended to happen. But the focus is on individual rights as if there is no such thing as society, right? As if that decision wouldn't dramatically impact the people around them, right? So if you sat in a classroom and you were unvaccinated and someone who, say, couldn't get the vaccine because they were immunocompromised, you might be exposing them to a deadly virus, right? So that way of thinking is directly tied to the sort of neoliberal logic. And again, this is a really constrained and narrow and not very well thought through conception of freedom and liberty. Likewise, the development of the vaccine was undertaken by huge multinational corporations, and they exploited decades of publicly supported research to produce miraculous discoveries like the RNA vaccine that the Pfizer and the Moderna are the two most effective vaccines against COVID. But even though this was a society-led endeavor, the profits have all accumulated at the corporate level. And this sets up a strange paradox because they've certainly produced something that is valuable to us, but it hasn't been spread throughout the world in an egalitarian way. So while many Americans are complaining about getting a vaccine as if it's tyranny, 16% of Africa is vaccinated, meaning 85%, 86% is not, right? That is sort of another good example of how the logic of neoliberalism works. So you understand. Questions about any of that? Okay.
I would also add that you got these kind of government subsidized research that enabled big pharma to create these vaccines that work and that are safe, but yet they've accumulated all the profits, and then that is kind of further undermine the trust in the vax, because you have a lot of the anti-vax folks that I know, they point to it as this, the whole thing is this kind of conspiracy by these corporations just to make money off of us. And so, it's this terrible paradox, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's safe and it works. You have the history of vaccination and all the diseases that they've eliminated over the last 200 years, right?
Yeah.
But yet there's this opening, right, for conspiracy theorists to jump into because of the neoliberal kind of.
Yeah, and well, I'm just frustrated to no end by the conspiracy mongering relative to the vaccines. I can't lay the blame on all of that on all of those who spread such lies and conspiratorial thinking. After all, I did mention at the second slide that we have a media cliff as well. And that is driven, yes, in part by social media, but also by big media and corporations themselves. So what bigger lie by the media, think of including social media, has been told in the last 20 years, bigger than weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, lying this country into war, right? So people are reacting to this. They're reacting to totally inadequate coverage up to the financial crisis as if it couldn't happen, and other perfectly legitimate missteps that could be pointed out. And it's not surprising that we've seen this decline of trust in institutions, including the media, and the rise of conspiratorial thinking.
I mean, there's also, it's just like a complete, it's like the trust thing, right? It's like, so we go in with almost no information. People are forced, they can't work, they're not given breaks on their housing. It's like, why?
Yeah,
I get where people, I don't get, but I also get it sometimes.
Perhaps it's useful to think about where knowledge even comes from, right? So we all know the world is round, right? What if you came upon a flat earther and you had to explain why, right?
I've tried.
Yeah.
I have a really good friend. We're still friends.
Why it's not, yeah.
Just like,
So you take the seemingly most slam dunk thing that you know, and in the end, climate change would be a much more complex thing that many of us know, quotation mark, right? But I couldn't sit here and talk for more than 15 minutes probably about the science of climate change. So there is a certain amount of faith that is required in knowing important things in this society. And the more that the media and other institutions discredit themselves, the less able we are to actually accomplish this in important ways. So neoliberalism and climate change, right? I'm not going to tackle all of the cliffs. I can't. But I thought, at least I'll think about the most dire one, most important one for your lives, for all of our lives. And that is climate change. According to the latest IPCC report, and that's another place I could stop and talk about suspicions and lack of trust, et cetera. But this is a group of hundreds of scientists reviewing peer-reviewed work on climate change, evidence that it's happening, over 10,000 peer-reviewed studies, and coming to the conclusion, among others, that we have maybe 10 years to restrict global warming to under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, right? Or what gets set in motion is feedback loops from nature, right? That will sort of take the decision of whether climate change is going to threaten or eliminate civilization as we know it out of our hands and into the hands of nature, right? So we have 10 years to make significant transformative change. Yet, we have a global economic system or an overwhelming logic of society that there's no such thing as society, that profit determines value. And the way profit is determined from the corporate point of view is very short term. So the idea of a threat like this one, where the worst effects will take place maybe near the end of your lives, although that horizon is shrinking as more is learned. From the perspective of profit being the driving logic of what is valued, there's no real way to react to this kind of threat. And the sorts of reactions or encouragements that we see regularly is we should all do at the individual level things to mitigate climate change. So you have calls for recycling, and I'm not saying you shouldn't recycle, but that's not going to be a big enough project along with all the other things we might do, like this building right here that we're operating in today. Grey Wolf Hall is supposed to be a more environmentally friendly building. And that's the sort of thing that we should do. But unless there's like this dramatic transformation I'm gesturing at, that's maybe going to earn us 10 more seconds of civilization, all those individual actions that we might take. Again, it's not like we shouldn't get in that mindset, but that's the sort of encouragement to action that you receive under the logic of neoliberalism. At the political level, you have sort of this dance between the Republican Party, which is mostly made up of people who deny that climate change is even happening. Or they explain it away and say it's natural processes all the way down, when it's undeniable now that human activities are driving this thing. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, a lot of people think of them as sort of the good guys, and I think certainly the better guys, it's the better party, right? In terms of at least acknowledging the science. But so far, Democratic Party action has amounted to basically performative outrage. In other words, laughing at, condemning, mocking Republicans for not acknowledging that climate change is happening. And both of those positions amount to the same thing, as long as the party that says it believes in climate change doesn't actually act to bring about a Green New Deal or bring about an expensive but necessary transformation of the means of production, for lack of a better phrase, right? So neoliberalism and climate change, if this logic continues, it's hard to see how we would get ourselves out of this. Now, I'm back at one of the other slides. I think I neglected to mention that, again, Adolph Reed suggests that neoliberalism is, we're coming to a crossroads. And the likelihood is that the logic will not be able to sustain itself for the reasons that I mentioned. People are distrustful of institutions, et cetera. There are all kinds of problems arising, including the pandemic, that are in part responsible for neoliberalism. So he suggests that we're at a crossroads and we're likely to head in a more fascistic, authoritarian right-wing direction, or we could go in a social democratic direction, with the obvious good choice being social democratic direction. But if we, but unfortunately, I think as I've communicated, the trends suggest we're likely to head into that authoritarian, continue down that authoritarian road. If that happens, I really shouldn't try to predict the future, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now. I would suggest this is what would take place. First of all, there'd be continued denial until there is a point at which it becomes just obvious to all that this is real, right? That climate change is real and that we're causing it, right? If that moment arose, and the later it happens, the worse, then I would expect to see what people do when they're under threat. They will look for a strong man or authority figure to save them. And democracy will go out the window, right? So it is an underappreciated threat from climate change that democracy is on the table as well, right? Solutions in this sort of circumstance, even though the public will be clamoring for someone to do something and surrendering whatever is left of democracy to the group of people who will then act, the likely solutions will most likely help those at the top rather than the broad section of humanity, right? And that goes for the national orientation as well. So probably nation-centric solutions, not global solutions, right? So the reason I have Trump's wall up here is to gesture at the fact that when and this is already happening, but as climate change really gets revved up, the likely scenario is that there will be more and more people needing to migrate because the land available to live on and have a life will be reduced. And so most likely in this sort of scenario, the wealthy countries will put up more and more barriers to try to keep more and more people out. So not a happy future if we don't go in the social democratic direction, if we instead go towards the more authoritarian future. So what about this social democratic option? What is it? Why would I even raise it up as a possibility or faith? First, I would suggest a form of it already worked. We've already had it. And in fact, some of what we have left of it is often what we point to as still kind of good aspects of our system. So what is the logic of social democracy? Well, there is such thing as society. And the focus is not just on individual rights, strictly considered, but instead on the public good. What would be in the public good, and not the corporate good, the public good. So, and I would also suggest that this is the best way forward when you consider that the New Deal period, and this is the 1930s and beyond reaction by the American government, social democratic reaction to the Great Depression, that laid the groundwork for what economists refer to as the golden age of capitalism in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. So prior to neoliberalism, there was a form of social democracy in our society. I mentioned before that one way to kind of localize this would be to think about how Everett Community College operated. So Everett Community College, just as a reminder, operated during the social democratic period in a way that students, their tuition costs were subsidized by the public. And again, most of the instructors had stable jobs and careers, right, rather than the gig economy. But under social democracy, wealth and income was far more equitably distributed. Just as a side note, a book I would really highly recommend on the subject of inequality is a book called The Spirit Level, which tracks the effects of inequality on in relation to a whole host of social pathologies, right? And you'd be surprised at the spread of pathologies that are driven by more and more inequality.
What's the title?
So it's the spirit level.
The spirit level?
Spirit level, yes. And so like crime, teen pregnancy, and from that point, a whole host of things you wouldn't think maybe were related to inequality end up being very related to inequality. So you already have a better society just by virtue of having a better distribution of wealth and income. So during our social democratic period, there were still rich people, but the top 1% only owned maybe around 10% of the country's wealth, rather than the 20% that they have now. So capital, the wealthy, were able to capture less and less of the product of the society, the product of workers, I might add. So the core assumption driving social democracy is that government can work for the average person, right? Again, it's working pretty well for corporate America right now. The idea here isn't necessarily more government, but the types of things that actually help the average person. Okay. If we think about the New Deal, there are dozens and dozens of policies we might think of, but here are some of the big ones that helped bring about a more egalitarian society, a better society for the average person. So Social Security, which is old age insurance, it's still around, although neoliberal efforts have been to privatize it or to make the retirement age go up, right? But Social Security is still around. Unemployment compensation, right? So that when you lose a job, you're not left hanging, trying to survive without any sort of money coming in. Public works projects, so building infrastructure, and with that, creating jobs. And of course, you can still see elements of this in today's society, so it's not an absolute break from this past, but much less so today. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a project that spanned 6 or 7 states in the American South and actually produced electricity for that region of the country, setting up the modern South. In other words, having the South join the modern economy. That was government, right, doing that. And then lastly, the Wagner Act, which was a democratic move. The Wagner Act established the right to join a union, the right to organize. And that will come back later as one of my understandings of, the main understanding of political change, organizing, right? So how would social democracy impact our ability to solve climate change? I can't promise that it would save everything, right? After all, we're way down the road of warming the planet. But I think it would give us our best opportunity to get a grip on the problem. So the driving question in a social democratic realm would be, what is in the public good, again, right? And what is sustainable rather than what is profitable, right? A few key projects that might be undertaken by a Green New Deal, which again aligns with the social democratic model, would be investing in renewable power sources and sustainable technologies. Investing in communities that are already impacted by climate change, repairing economic or environmental damage. Repairing and upgrading infrastructure and investing in public transportation, like light rail and bullet trains, right? Putting unemployed people back to work in sustainable industries. In other words, a lot of the industries like coal mining simply can't continue. And we should disabuse ourselves of the idea that coal mining is the lifeblood of a growing number of workers, sustained amount of work. There are fewer and fewer people actually involved in coal mining, right? As automation and mechanization takes over that industry, just like all the other ones. But there'll still be a lot of people that lose their jobs if you abandon that sort of production of energy. And you have to be committed to those people. One of the reasons why, say, the average coal miner might resist the idea like the Green New Deal is they don't understand. A major plank in this would be to make sure that they have a different job to go to with a real commitment to that, not just one kind of voiced and then ignored. And then finally, another aspect of a Green New Deal would be the production of a realm of environmental justice, both nationally and globally. So currently under neoliberalism, a lot of the pollution that is the consequence of production in our society is visited upon poorer communities, non-white communities, right? Similarly, a lot of the pollution that kills millions of people every year, air pollution kills millions of people every year, is visited upon the global south, right? And that production, the wealth accumulated, goes up to us, right, to the global north. And not to us, right, it's obviously skewed towards the very wealthy in the United States and in the north. So that would be an option, a path to take. The question is, how do you get there, right? Maybe I've convinced you this is the better path forward. But again, my frustration is that it's not obvious we'll take it. And I know the way to get to this sort of thing requires a lot of time, requires a change of orientation. And I would put it this way. You take anything you like about this country, I mean really like about this country, and it is almost certainly the product of everyday people organizing to pressure the system to bring about change. So for example, the abolitionist movement, getting rid of slavery, anti-war movements, various stages of the women's movement, the more recent LGBTQ movement, and especially the labor movement, has created the elbow room in the political system to force or allow politicians to take actions they wouldn't otherwise do. So there's this probably invented story of Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, once he was elected president, or during the Great Depression, once he's elected president, hosting a group of activists at the White House. And supposedly, these activists laid out this array of programs they wanted him to pursue, which would, if he had, would come right up against the interests of capital, the interests of corporations. And Roosevelt is said to have replied, "I agree with you. I've been persuaded. I want to do all these things. Now go out and make me do it." And the idea was that organized pressure around the society would help align other elites with these activist desires, and he'd be able to do it. In reality, that probably never happened. And anyway, elected officials do not like a disruptive, organized mass below them. They like to be left to decide things on their own. So it's probably not something that actually happened, but the logic of it is right on, right? That organizing, going out with like-minded people and organizing to pressure the government to accomplish actual policies that will help you in everyday life, or that will pressure for a Green New Deal, and a form of a Green New Deal that helps everybody, right? Working class people. And how would I define working class? Anybody who needs their job. So it's a kind of a broad idea of that. If you could quit your job tomorrow and then you'd be fine for 5 years, probably not in the working class. But if you quit your job and you desperately need help within a short amount of time, working class, right? So pressuring social democracy would involve people building a society by pressuring that society through political action, not just voting for whomever they might see as a political savior of the moment. That is a recipe for disappointment, right? So as I mentioned, this is the path forward, right? But it takes time. I mentioned the abolitionist movement and some of these other movements. The early work on these things, take the abolitionist movement, that started at least at the American Revolution. And so, the bottom line is the accomplishment of the ideals that early abolitionists wanted done, that didn't happen until they were mostly dead and gone. And that's typically the way it works. If you really want something fundamental to change about your society, which is what we need, it typically takes a long period of time, and we don't have the time. So that is one of the reasons why, to harken back, why I was kind of troubled by our humanities theme. It's like, it's hard to see hope, but you can't really wake up and live your life like that. You have to act as if. You have to act as if you can actually make the change that you need to bring about. And so that is what I would recommend is if you have a union at your workplace, join it. If you don't, maybe start one. Think of ways where you can get together with like-minded people, and sometimes people you even disagree with heartily about other issues, and combine to help solve problems that are in front of you. The more people do that, the more likely that can add up to bringing about a transformation of the society itself. And I do think, speaking of people you might disagree with profoundly, that this sort of action plays an educational role as well. So I mentioned, racism and sexism, anti-immigrant. These are other aspects of the cliffs that we're facing. I think those actually get solved in this, more likely to be solved with this approach as well. The more people work with diverse partners, in other words, to bring about changes that benefit them and benefit the public good, I think that's actually the best way to reduce some of these other societal pathologies. And I would add one more element to this, an element that was not included during the original New Deal, right? I would suggest a democratic socialist ingredient be added to the otherwise social democratic model. So what is this? Well, it builds on a phrase that actually harkens back to 19th century America, specifically young women who were employed at textile mills and were among the first to form labor organizations to pressure for better conditions. And one of their mantras was not just better conditions, but the notion that those who work in the mill ought to own them. And that can be kind of fast-forwarded. This ideal can be found in a proposal that the Bernie Sanders campaign came up with, obviously not implemented and he wasn't elected, but it was nevertheless proposed that legislation be passed that would require that as corporations grow, as firms grow, once they past a certain threshold, that stocks issued by that company, at least a small portion of them start to be issued to workers. And the idea, if you play it out as over a long enough period of time, the workers end up owning the majority of shares. They end up owning the mills that they work in, right? Now, I would suggest maybe a little more radical approach to this, and that a more, purposeful transfer of ownership using the same sort of mechanism take place, right? So in the end, once workers had a majority share, maybe most or all of the shares, they would decide how to organize the company. They would decide the wages. They would decide what the company produced. They would decide where the company operated, right? And other things. And this would solve a key problem with New Deal reform, social democracy that I've so far pointed to as being the model, the past as the model for the future. The New Deal presented many reforms, and I just touched on a few, like Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right to unionize, and that sort of thing. One thing it did not do, it did not affect the overall economic system at its root. It left capital in the hands of capitalists, small group of people. And what that meant was that over the decades, this concentrated possession of wealth could be leveraged against the political system to undermine all of the reforms that had taken place during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? The period where New Deal logic held sway. So if you do that, you leave capital in the hands of a small number of people, they're going to have the resources to push back. And the people will get distracted. Maybe they'll get happy with their lives so much that they sort of ignore politics. They think it's not really something that concerns them in their everyday life. Capital never sleeps with regard to politics. So one thing this would do, if you had eventually a process where workers owned a significant amount of the economy themselves, it would take this off the table. It would reduce the pressure on the system that would be organized around taking away what had been won, hard won through organization. All right, so that's a key point. Did that make sense? Yes. Yeah. So, am I optimistic? Not really. A frequent thing you heard Obama say and others say is that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. It doesn't necessarily bend towards justice. The good news is that at least for the time being, it is up to us whether it does or not. Thank you.